Welcome, folks, to the Wendy and Betty McMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale. I am David Mayhew, a Sterling Professor of Political Science, or at least I once was. I'm retired now. And I'm delighted to host Susan Dunn at this year's set of Henry L. Stimson lectures, 3 of them. We hadn't met, she and I hadn't met. We've been teaching in New England forever, it seems, at least me in my case, for an awful long time. We hadn't met, but I feel as if I've met her because I kept reading her books forever and enjoying her books. So it's good, yes, in person, it's great. It's really, there's a string of books I've read. Susan Dunn is the Massachusetts Professor of Humanities at Williams College in Mass, and the author of a dozen books. My handout here says dozen. Jefferson's Second Revolution, the Election Crisis of 1800 is one of them, which I've read and enjoyed. That's about the election of 1800. She has a talent for picking important topics and telling us about them. That was a really very important election. As our colleague over in the law school wrote once, Bruce Ackerman, it's okay to write a constitution, but can you keep it from falling apart? And the election of 1800 was an instance where it could have fallen apart. They had to come to some settlement. The election was a mess. You think this election is a mess, try 1800. It was a real mess. They had to come to some kind of settlement, and they did it. And she told us about that. Then, what else? Let's see if she got it. If you read it. Another book was Roosevelt's Purge, How FDR Fought to Change the Democratic Party. That's another very important topic. It was Roosevelt in 38, he disgruntled with the Democrats, so he tries to kill off a lot of them in the primaries of 1938. It didn't work, but it's a very important event in the history of the New Deal, and no president has tried anything like it since. There was a lesson there. Then there's a book called 1940. Here's another book about an election. And again, this is one of the key elections in American history of 1940. The book is FDR, Wilkie, Lindbergh, Hitler, the election amid the storm. What a bunch of characters, those 4. FDR, Wilkie, Lindbergh, Hitler, very heterogeneous, but a bunch of characters. And this is the setting. It was the 1940, the Nazis march west. They get to the Atlantic. In, I guess, May in 1940, the Nazis do. England is up in balance for several months, and then the American election comes down. And Roosevelt has to decide whether to run again, and he does. And Wilkie comes out of nowhere to run against him, one of your characters in that book. And then the election is important at least because the 2 candidates kind of converged into being anti-isolationists. I mean, not exactly, but still, even so, very important outcome. Very important outcome. Yes, then, now she's been here this week to give us 3 lectures on what she calls FDR's third 100 days, referring back to the first 100 days is very famous back in 1933. Preparing for war and global leadership, and her time span for these 3 lectures is November 1940 through March 1941. The first of the 3 lectures, which you were here for perhaps the other day, was entitled Plan Dog, From Isolation to a Strategy for War, at which time the U.S. government's got its act together. They didn't have much of an act previously. They got FDR, Marshall, they put something together. Then yesterday, her lecture was a declaration of interdependence, the Lend-Lease, and she told us about this is one of the most important legislative drives of American national history, the enactment of Lend-Lease in the spring, or late winter anyway, of 1941, and she brought us through that. Now today, her last lecture is entitled Speed and Speed Now, Mobilizing Industry and Labor for War. That's the time when they zoomed up the army from nothing to a lot, and or at least got it going. Got it go. I think that's what you're going to tell us about. Yeah, something like that. The funding for this lecture series, the Stimson series, comes from an anonymous donor in honor of Henry L. Stimson, a very important figure during this war time, brought in to run the Defense Department in 1940. Yale College, 1889, was Stimson. an attorney and statesman whose government service culminated with his tenure as Secretary of War during World War II. On the Macmillan Center again, the Macmillan Center and Yale University Press have collaborated to bring distinguished diplomats and foreign policy experts to the center to lecture on their books that come out of these lecture series and that are published by Yale Press. A book will come out, we'll have it. Previous Stimson lecture books have included by Sam Huntington, Political Order in Changing Societies, by Thomas Schelling, let's see, what is it? Arms and Influence, an influential book, a long time ago. John Dunn, the British political theorist, Beyond the Democratic Maze, M-A-Z-E, and Michael Walzer, What Happened to National Liberation. She follows in a distinguished series. And I am pleased to introduce Professor Susan Dunn.
Thank you. That was very nice. Hello again. Well, thank you, Professor Mayhew. This is definitely a mutual admiration society. In my first two talks this week, I spoke about the transformational ideas and legislation of Franklin Roosevelt's third 100 days, Plan Dog and Lend-Lease. Today, I'd like to get down into the nitty-gritty of the nation's mobilization for war. In the months between his re-election in November 1940 and his signing of the Lend-Lease Act in March 41, Roosevelt made great progress in dealing with the extraordinary challenge of putting the entire American economy on a wartime basis. It was a task that included three major players: labor, management, and government. And it involved the critical need for all of them to work together in harmony as a team. In December 1940, a reporter for Time magazine ventured out of the nation's capital and wrote that leaving that enclave was like leaving the quiet of an office to walk into the crashing roar of a factory. The wheels of defense industries were turning from coast to coast, and in some places around the clock. Industrial plants that had been quiet since the beginning of the Depression were buzzing again. Companies that used to produce lawnmowers, vacuum cleaners, textiles, adding machines, and mechanical pencils were now turning out shrapnel, gas masks, mosquito netting, automatic pistols, and precision instruments. By mid-February 1941, steel mills in Birmingham, Alabama were operating at 100% capacity. From the Texas Gulf Coast to Newport News, Virginia, shipyards received $1 billion in orders for destroyers, freighters, and cargo ships. For the first time in 10 years, companies were investing in new facilities for mass production. New airplane factories, new chemical plants, textile mills were springing up all over the country. The United States was unleashing all its industrial resources and preparing for possible war. And tens of millions of Americans were participating in this remarkable transformation. The labor force was booming. More Americans were employed than at any time since the crash of 1929. Millions of men and women of all ages were streaming into factories and working on assembly lines. Men in the new cuffless trousers and women wearing slacks for the first time. Vocational schools were training men and women for new roles in the workforce. And all the new workers needed places to live. They couldn't be expected to commute long distances, and they couldn't live in tents, as one government official had proposed. And so 2.5 million new homes were built, along with schools and recreational facilities. And to manage it all, in July 1940, Roosevelt created a new agency called the Division of Defense Housing. He realized that workers' morale was absolutely critical to the defense effort. The energy of all this industrial activity was producing prosperity in cities and towns throughout the country. Communities that had lain stagnant for years were now expanding and thriving. That oceanic vitality, built on the top of the social and economic programs of the 1930s, would finally fulfill the promises of the New Deal. Small cities like York, Pennsylvania, 100 miles west of Philadelphia and with a population of 56,000, were becoming industrial beehives. In January 41, the manager of the State Employment Service in York remarked that a year ago the task had been to find jobs for men. Now the task was to find men for jobs. The search for workers was so thorough that even old payrolls were being checked. Defense contracts worth tens of millions of dollars were pouring into York. The city's factories were turning out tanks, tank guns, anti-aircraft guns, shells, and trench mortars. A New York Times reporter visiting York was stunned by the changes in the lives of workers, employers, merchants, teachers, cab drivers, salesgirls, and clergymen. He wrote that there was a new spirit of community and solidarity in York. And he said that workers and employers alike talked patriotism without getting pompous about it, and that they all spoke about the necessity of making sacrifices. By early 41, the US military had become the biggest buyer and consumer of the nation's industrial output. And it was also a reliable source of big profits. And yet, all this massive production wasn't enough. Not enough to arm the United States for its own defense, and not enough to supply Britain with all it needed to defend itself against Nazi Germany. Production lagged behind schedule. Some manufacturers refused or neglected War Department orders. And as demand exceeded supply, as corporate profits soared, and as workers fought to protect their rights, the Roosevelt administration was struggling to set up an effective agency to oversee all aspects of defense production. President Roosevelt recognized that such a radical undertaking depended on national unity. And by coincidence, in early December, the Economic Club of New York held a meeting entitled National Unity for Defense and invited the president to speak at its formal dinner at the Waldorf Astoria. Roosevelt was cruising in the Caribbean, but he sent a message to be read aloud to the eminent guests who were the cream of the nation's industrial and financial elite. He astutely framed his remarks about unity under the banner of individual rights and freedom. His brand of unity had nothing in common with the mind-numbing fascist collectivism shoved down the throats of the populations of Germany and Italy. FDR said plainly, and I quote, "There can be no real unity where the people have no voice. In a democratic order, national unity is the voluntary expression of the mind and spirit of a free people. The freedoms that we must and will protect in the United States are the freedoms that will make the individual paramount in a true democracy." Roosevelt envisaged national unity in the same way that the Founding Fathers did, by placing priceless value on the freedom of the human mind, on open public debate and deliberation, on due process and individual rights. He believed that unity for the defense of American self-government and unity for the defeat of Nazi Germany would expand individual freedom, not limit it. The question then was how to convince free, rational, autonomous, and self-interested citizens to work and sacrifice for the nation's defense and survival. How to encourage a unanimous effort without resorting to a regimented society. Pitching his ideas to the high-powered executives in the audience, the president, or perhaps his speechwriter, made the point that political freedom went hand in hand with economic freedom, and that it was therefore crucial for government, private enterprise, and labor to work harmoniously together as partners. He emphasized that the owners of industry and the men and women they employed must all receive fair and proper rewards for their service. But such unity and cooperation would indeed turn out to be more difficult to achieve in the United States than in Britain, probably because British cities and industrial centers were being bombed almost every single night, while Americans slept quietly in their own beds and not in crowded underground shelters. Virtually every aspect and every member of British society had become organized and disciplined for war. In December 1940, Prime Minister Churchill appointed his Minister of Labor, Ernest Bevin, to serve as the head of all defense production in Britain. With the goal of total mobilization, Bevin laid down the law. Everybody in this war, he said, has to be a member of the working class or the army. All special privileges must entirely disappear into the common pool. Bevin lengthened the work week and increased wages, but he also made strikes and lockouts illegal. Workers in defense industries were forbidden to leave their jobs without government permission, and employers couldn't fire their employees except for misconduct. Men who were too old for military service and young women were drafted for work in war industries. That winter, Columbia University's famous historian Alan Nevins was at Oxford, and he sent an article back to the New York Times in which he described the unprecedented centralization of government authority in England. And he wondered how Americans, who still felt safe in their homes and towns, could be persuaded that they, like the British, would have to sacrifice the ordinary habits of ordinary times. First of all, industry had to play its part. During the Great Depression, FDR had branded American industrialists and financiers unscrupulous money changers and economic royalists, turning them into an outgroup. He attacked their false leadership and expressed satisfaction that they had fled from their high seats in the temple of our civilization. The heroes of the Roaring Twenties had become the villains of the New Deal, the age of the common man. But in 1940, the tables were turning yet again. These powerful captains of industry were the producers, the can-doers. They knew how to make things. They owned the factories that were essential to American defense, and now FDR needed them. They would soon hitch a lucrative ride on what would become the greatest expansion of industrial capacity in history. But in 1940, their achievements were neither heroic nor even adequate. Manufacturers were often half-hearted in filling defense contracts. Some gave priority to more profitable consumer and commercial orders, while others wanted guarantees against losses before they invested in new facilities. The person ultimately in charge of making sure that industrial production met the needs of the American military was Secretary of War Henry Stimson. He was concerned about bottlenecks in war production, and especially about airplane manufacturers who were too slow to convert to a wartime footing. Some of these manufacturers not only maintained their peacetime level of production for commercial planes, but even planned to double it in 1941. In late November, Stimson held a press conference and voiced his outrage that the manufacturers of planes and aircraft engines were focused on their own profits at the expense of the war effort. Which is more vital to the nation now, he asked, increased military and naval strength or increased business for commercial airlines? He publicly shamed one company, the Douglas Aircraft Company in California, for still churning out big commercial planes while lagging 2 months behind schedule in filling War Department orders. I think we put the fear of God into the Douglas Company, Stimson hopefully wrote in his diary. And what about labor? In 1940, the House of Labor was divided and subdivided. On Thanksgiving Day, November 21st, 1940, a fist fight broke out in the bar of the Hotel Roosevelt in New Orleans. The New York Times young labor reporter Abe Raskin was there for the annual convention of the American Federation of Labor, the nation's largest labor union. Raskin was having a quiet drink with David Dubinsky, the respected head of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, when a man named Joey Fay, the tough boss of the notoriously corrupt construction unions in New Jersey, drunkenly marched over to their table and called Dubinsky all kinds of dirty names for proposing anti-racketeering resolutions, and then he punched Dubinsky in the face. The next day, Raskin's account of the assault made the front page of the New York Times, while Dubinsky, for his part, tried to capitalize on the brawl to drum up support for his anti-racketeering resolution. But the delegates at the AFL convention agreed only that local unions should try to expel corrupt leaders from their ranks. While the AFL was holding its convention in New Orleans and grappling with the problem of racketeers, the CIO was holding its own convention in Atlantic City and was grappling with the problem of communists in its ranks. And the communists were as real and aggressive as the AFL racketeers. These in-house clashes were harmful distractions from the main business of protecting the interests of union members, but far more damaging to the nation's industrial mobilization was the venomous rancor between the AFL and the CIO. In 1940 and 41, there were hundreds of strikes, but surprisingly, many of them were not about wages or working conditions, but rather about which of the two giant labor organizations would win the right to organize and represent workers in a particular plant or industry. These kinds of strikes were called jurisdictional strikes, a very bland name for strikes that could be vicious and long-lasting and that halted critical work in defense factories. The AFL and the CIO shared a very convoluted and complicated history. The American Federation of Labor was founded in the 19th century and retained its original character as an alliance of small craft unions. The CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, included only all-encompassing industry-wide unions like the United Mine Workers and the UAW, United Auto Workers. The CIO had been born inside the AFL in 1935, but in 1938, the labor leaders who had created the CIO took it out of the AFL, and now there were two rival labor giants that were blood enemies. But in 1940, one of the CIO founders, David Dubinsky, was upset with the dictatorial style of the CIO leader, John L. Lewis, the president of the United Mine Workers. And so, Dubinsky took the Ladies Garment Workers Union back to the AFL. And that move ignited even more bitterness between the AFL and the CIO. President Roosevelt and his labor secretary, Francis Perkins, had tried repeatedly to narrow the rift between the two major labor organizations, pleading with their leaders to find a way to restore unity and harmony to organized labor, or, as they said, at least to come up with a sensible working arrangement. The AFL president was willing to cooperate and meet with CIO representatives, but CIO leaders were intransigent and slammed the door shut. They insisted that there could be no unity in the labor movement except when the AFL surrendered to the CIO and accepted the CIO's model of a single union representing an entire industry. Stalemate. The rivalry between the two labor giants resulted in fierce unionization campaigns and walkouts. But some strikes really were about wages and working conditions. The Roosevelt administration had always strongly backed labor rights, and working people always had a place of honor in FDR's coalition. In 1935, the bond between the White House and labor produced the National Labor Relations Act, also known as the Wagner Act. After decades of harsh struggles, workers finally won the right to organize in unions and engage in collective bargaining, with the national government playing referee to ensure an equitable playing field. The Roosevelt administration was on labor's side until the crisis year of 1940. Then the administration began to see things differently and viewed work stoppages as threats to the nation's survival. One highly disruptive walkout in late 1940 illustrated the new complexities in industrial production. 5,000 workers at the Vultee Aircraft Company plant in California went on strike and halted work on defense orders for military planes. During the previous 5 months, hundreds of labor disputes had taken place all over the country, though most lasted just a few hours or a few days. But the strike at Vultee went on for a month. Workers were demanding a 25-cent increase in the 50-cent hourly wage so that their wage would be the same as employees doing similar work in automobile factories. Even Eleanor Roosevelt weighed in about the Vultee strike in her My Day newspaper column. She asked why workers were expected to accept low wages and long hours for the sake of national defense when management wasn't willing to cut profits and executive salaries. Her verdict was that sacrifices have to be equal. After all, industry was booming, profits escalating, corporate executives pocketing enormous salaries, and labor wanted a fair piece of the pie. War Department officials went to the Vultee headquarters to help mediate the conflict, and finally, after days of tense negotiations, the strike was over. Workers won a pay raise, more paid vacation time, and an annual sick leave. And in exchange, they accepted a no-strike clause and agreed to resolve future disputes with an arbitration board. In the end, the clash at Vultee proved relatively easy to settle. Workers had strong union representation, management agreed to negotiate with union leaders, and government mediation succeeded. During FDR's third 100 days, more than 300 highly disruptive strikes took place. Whether they were jurisdictional disputes or wage disputes, they all slowed down defense production. And so on March 19, 1941, Roosevelt created by executive order the National Defense Mediation Board. Its mission was to settle strikes in defense industries, first by facilitating collective bargaining, and failing that by participating in mediation, and as a last resort by proposing binding arbitration. The mediation board proved highly effective in reducing the number and length of strikes. And by the end of 1941, it had resolved over 1,000 walkouts. But when labor and management both rejected arbitration, Roosevelt, in his role as commander-in-chief, could direct the Army to take over a plant. Congress had given the administration what amounted to control over the nation's defense industries. One section of the 1940 Selective Service Act was known as the Russell-Overton Amendment. Senators Overton of Louisiana and Russell of Georgia reasoned that if the government could draft young men, it should also be able to draft industry. It authorized the government to take over the factories of any companies that didn't cooperate in national defense. And in 1941, the president did indeed command the War Department to take over the operations of several airplane factories where strikes were tying up production on thousands of military planes. There was another serious challenge concerning labor management and government. The owners of some very large manufacturing companies simply refused to allow their workers to unionize. And this presented Roosevelt with a very thorny problem. Yes, the Wagner Act had given workers the right to unionize, opening the door to mass unionization. But the administration urgently needed the production capabilities of those union-busting companies. And so it felt it had no choice but to give them large defense contracts. The most defiant industrialist was none other than the elderly Henry Ford, the inventor of the assembly line and the father of mass production. Not only did Ford, a notorious anti-Semite, run factories in Germany that produced military vehicles for the Nazi army, Ford also believed that the British Empire was a doomed and unworthy cause. And in June 1940, Ford refused to accept a government contract to manufacture plane engines for the Royal Air Force. For years, Ford had violated labor laws and resisted the right of its workers to be represented by the UAW. The company even had a so-called service department that employed thugs who regularly and brutally beat up union organizers. On 9 different occasions, the National Labor Relations Board had found Ford guilty of violating the Wagner Act. It was an appalling record, but there was no other company in the US that had such massive and modern production facilities. For example, Ford's gigantic River Rouge plant in Dearborn, Michigan, measured 1.5 miles by 1 mile. It comprised 93 buildings and had its own docks, mill, and electric plant, as well as a private railroad track that wove in and out of its many buildings. Ford Motor was so important to national defense that FDR and Secretary of War Stimson decided to put Ford's anti-union activities behind them and concentrate on persuading Ford to play fair with labor in the future. And so in November 1940, 6 months after Ford rejected that government contract for plane engines for the RAF, and just 1 month after a federal appeals court found Ford guilty of igniting a labor riot at one of its plants, the War Department awarded Ford, and Ford accepted, a $120 million contract for more than 4,000 engines, this time all for the American Army and Navy. But in the spring of '41, Ford's relations with its labor force changed abruptly. In March, a Ford official vowed that the company would meet with UAW representatives when hell freezes over, and that workers wouldn't get a damn thing. Well, 3 months later, hell froze over. The president of Ford Motor was Henry Ford's son, Edsel. Edsel was often overruled by his father, but he was better grounded in reality. He wasn't deaf to patriotism, and he wasn't blind to the opportunities for tremendous profits in defense contracts. In June '41, Ford finally surrendered to the UAW and gave the union virtually everything it asked for. The company agreed to pay a wage equal to the highest in the industry and to abolish the company's goon squad. And the payoff was huge. By December 7th, 1941, Ford held government contracts worth over $300 million, which today would be $5 billion. Other anti-union corporations followed Ford's lead. In 1941, 6 years after Congress passed the Wagner Act, companies like Bethlehem Steel, Westinghouse, and International Harvester finally recognized their workers' rights to unionize. And that year, union membership grew by 1.5 million workers. And now let's move on to the complicated role of government in defense production. It alone could set priorities, award contracts, balance domestic and foreign orders, make sure that strategic raw materials like aluminum and zinc were available, oversee transportation of weapons, and help settle labor disputes. That was a tremendously complex endeavor. For example, most industries marked their own orders A1 priority, so that 90% of all defense orders fell in the A1 priority, which really meant that there were no priorities at all. Procurement posed another problem, because the Army had neither experts nor experience in knowing what products to buy or how to buy them. In the spring of 1940, Roosevelt had established the National Defense Advisory Commission, the NDAC, to bring order to this chaos. But FDR granted it only limited authority, so the NDAC simply added to the disorder that it was supposed to subdue. Secretary of War Stimson was the first to realize that the NDAC was a failure. He understood better than anyone else the urgent need for a powerful new agency that could cut red tape, award contracts, oversee production, and resolve labor disputes. When he met with Roosevelt right after Roosevelt's Lend-Lease Garden Hose press conference in mid-December, they agreed about the ineffectiveness of the NDAC and began to form a plan to replace it. At a press conference in late December, FDR told reporters that he would soon be shaking up the whole defense structure. He said that he would issue an executive order establishing a new Office for Production Management. According to that executive order, the new OPM would have vast authority, and I quote, to formulate and execute all measures necessary to increase the production of everything required for national defense, and to ensure effective coordination of government, industry, and labor. And that was big. FDR established the OPM in January 41, and it was another crucial step in his third 100 days. The OPM had three main branches. One dealt with procurement and contracts, the second would oversee management, and the third would deal with labor. Some officials in the War Department complained that labor should have been granted only an unofficial advisory role. But both Roosevelt and Stimson understood that preparations for war and mobilization of all the nation's defense industries would depend almost completely on American workers. Stimson declared that labor represented the backbone of defense and that labor would be an equal and respected partner with industry. In March 41, the Senate created its own committee, chaired by Missouri's Harry Truman, to act as a watchdog over the National Defense Program. The Truman Committee scrutinized defense contracts, investigated industry corruption, and uncovered government mismanagement and waste. And it did all that in order to reassure Americans that the defense buildup was not a riot of profiteering, corruption, excessive government spending, and incompetence, as it had been to some extent in World War I. But the Truman Committee still found plenty of problems. For example, Truman's investigation into the Army camp construction program led to a complete overhaul of all phases of that program. His committee exposed companies that were selling defective material to the government, and it brought the hammer down on businesses making excessive profits on defense contracts. Some of those embarrassed firms won redemption by cutting executive salaries to near nothing and eliminating profits from production and offering workers attractive salaries and bonuses. A few large companies like GE and Eastman Kodak voluntarily turned over a part of their profits to government. But Truman nevertheless remarked, and I quote, "Labor feels it owes a duty to labor, Business feels that it owes a duty to stockholders, but both often fail to realize that the duty they owe is to the country. Ultimately, cooperation between labor management and government worked remarkably well. Big business was coming on board. The members of FDR's administration were finally finding common ground with the powerful men they had denounced in 1936. And responsible union leaders made a no-strike pledge to the president, though strikes did continue. Some workers were lackadaisical. There were cases of greedy management and outright fraud in industry. And there were plenty of disputes between civilian and military officials. The war crisis didn't change human nature or abolish self-interest, but the sheer might of American industry nevertheless made the United States the greatest producer of armaments the world had ever known. Together, labor and industry produced a vast flood of war materiel, without compromising labor unions, workers' rights, or the profit-making free enterprise system. Democracy in America hardly had to trim its sails. I found a few songs from the early 1940s that celebrated the contributions that unions and all Americans made to the war effort. Since I'm tone deaf, I'm not going to sing them, but these are the lyrics to one UAW song. The UAW-CIO makes the Army roll and go, turning out the jeeps and tanks and airplanes every day, putting wheels on the USA. There'll be a union label in Berlin when the union boys in uniform march in. And here are the lyrics from a song from the 1942 Cole Porter musical, Panama Hattie. Oh, capital may take a wallop at labor. The CIO may slug the AFL, though our melting pot may boil red hot with 1,000 different types. Though we lefties and righties may have our fights, we all stand pat on the no-good rat who belittles the stars and stripes. That's available on YouTube. At the end of Roosevelt's 300 days in March 41, the United States was neither fully at peace nor fully at war, and the president himself was not fully reconciled to unrestricted American involvement in the war. He remained reluctant to move too far ahead of public opinion, even though a majority of Americans had come to embrace his internationalist leadership. He believed the country needed more time to rearm, and he told his close aides that he was waiting for some major provocation to push him into war. He had effectively boxed himself into a policy of all aid to Britain short of war. And yet, despite his caution, Franklin Roosevelt's 300 days constituted one of the most fertile periods in his long presidency. 3 winter months during which his administration rejected neutrality and isolation, approved crucial preparations for war, made a commitment to victory, and put in focus and in motion the means necessary to achieve that victory. From December 1940 through March 41, he made for the first time speeches and press conferences to reorient American foreign policy in a frankly internationalist direction. He educated Americans about the challenge that the nation and the world faced. He laid out his policies and the motivating causes and values behind them. And he spoke about the sacrifices he would ask his fellow citizens to make in order to achieve the paramount goal of defeating Germany, all of which had previously been only half spoken. By the end of March, Plan Dog, the ABC talks that provided a forum for Anglo-British military collaboration, Lend-Lease, the shift to a wartime economy, and the prodigious acceleration of defense production were all irrevocably underway. Though Roosevelt made no public declaration of intention, all of this amounted to a covert declaration of war. Those winter months also marked a shift in the national consciousness, a decisive, irreversible step out of the past and into the future. In January 1941, Roosevelt's Four Freedoms address began to articulate his vision for the post-war world, beyond the destruction of Nazi Germany. He pictured an era that would see American ascendancy across military, political, social, economic, cultural, and moral realms. That vision of America's dominant global role emerged during FDR's third 100 days. On August 9th, 1941, a conference began aboard the American cruiser Augusta, anchored in Placentia Bay on the coast of Newfoundland. Roosevelt had traveled there for secret meetings with Winston Churchill. The two men greeted each other warmly. The Prime Minister was desperately hoping for an American declaration of war. Instead, he received the consolation prize of almost unlimited access to American weapons. What Roosevelt wanted from Churchill was less tangible than rifles, tanks, and planes. He came seeking a joint statement of where the two allies stood in terms of their war aims, and also a declaration to the world of what the two allies stood for. Their landmark statement would be known as the Atlantic Charter. Roosevelt considered it a path to global cooperation and peacekeeping, as well as a path to human rights everywhere in the world. The two nations pledged to forsake territorial expansion, to permit territorial changes only when the people concerned approved them, and to make sure that self-government was restored to those who had been forcibly deprived of it. That was a clause that applied not only to the victims of the Axis, but also to people living under European colonialism. And indeed, it would inspire independence movements in European colonies around the world. The Charter also made explicit reference to two of FDR's four freedoms, freedom from want and freedom from fear. Roosevelt and Churchill hoped to create, and I quote, world peace that will afford to all nations the means of dwelling in safety within their own boundaries, so that all men in all lands may live out their lives in freedom from fear and freedom from want. For Roosevelt, the Charter represented not just a symbolic gesture, it was a commitment to a common human fraternity. Roosevelt was the dominant partner at the meeting in Placentia Bay. He didn't give Britain what Churchill most wanted, though he obtained from Churchill what he most wanted. Yet, aboard the Augusta, the two men formed a genuine working friendship, one that set the tone for Anglo-American cooperation amid the whirlwind of war. A world tragedy had brought them together, and now they walked the long and stark road toward the future together. Well, I've always been pre-punctual, and I finished writing that conclusion, that was my conclusion. I finished writing that conclusion about the Atlantic Charter last summer on July 1st. That day, I heard on the news that it was the 100th anniversary of the beginning of the 5-month-long Battle of the Somme in northern France. When that battle ended in November 1916, there were about 150,000 dead, 300,000 wounded, and countless more psychically maimed. That day last July was also 1 week after the Brexit vote in the United Kingdom, a vote that seemed to me to unravel the ties that helped give stability and harmony to the European nations that had suffered utter devastation in 2 world wars. The Brexit vote was a triumph for British isolationists. And on July 1st, it was a day when Donald Trump, as usual, made his vow to make America great again by building walls and dismantling alliances. When he adopted the toxic 1940 isolationist slogan, America First, and boasted about his good European genes, and when he railed against immigrants and free trade, I thought things were as bad as they could get. Not so. Today we face the ominous possibility that the post-war international system might collapse. Trump himself predicted that his election victory would be Brexit times 10. Are Donald Trump, Marine Le Pen, and Brexit the wave of the future? And so as some of our fellow Americans retreat into nativism and xenophobia, as they call for closed borders and restricted trade, and practice unrestricted religious and racial prejudice, I thought we should turn to our Yale graduate, Henry Stimson, for help. His 1947 article in Foreign Affairs, entitled "The Challenge to Americans," speaks to us today, and I'll close this talk with his words. "This nation must put away forever any thought that America can again be an island unto herself. No private program and no public policy in any sector of our national life can now escape from the compelling fact that if it is not framed with reference to the world, it is framed with perfect futility. Our stake in the peace and freedom of the world is not a limited liability. Time after time in the past, we have tried to solve our foreign problems with halfway measures, acting under the illusion that we could be partly in the world and partly irresponsible. I have served as Secretary of State under President Hoover in a time of frightened isolationism, and as Secretary of War under President Franklin Roosevelt in a time of brave and generous action. I know the withering effect of limited commitments, and I know the regenerative power of full action. The attitude of isolationism, political or economic, must die. The vain hope that we can live alone must be abandoned. It is evident that we cannot do everything we'd like, but it would be a shriveling timidity for Americans to refuse to play their full and necessary part in the world. All men, good and bad, are now our neighbors. Freedom demands tolerance, and many Americans have much to learn about the variety of forms that free societies may take. We must act in the world as it is, and not in the world as we wish it were, or even as we would like it to become. It is a world in which we are only one people out of many, and in which our basic principles of freedom, equality, and due process are not shared by all our neighbors. But Americans must now understand that the United States has become, for better or for worse, a wholly committed member of the world community. That is a plain fact. Our only choice is whether or not to face it. I'll end my talk here, and I thank Henry Stimson for his wise and timely words and for holding my hand this week. And I thank all of you.